Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we'll be talking about the the first round of fighting between Britain, Germany, and France in World War II. We will also talk about the Lease program that is going to begin pushing the United States towards involvement in World War II. And of course, we know that World War II started in 1939, September 1st, when the German troops rolled into Poland. And we also understand that the United States did not enter the war for over 2 years. We don't enter the war until December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, which will, by the way, be the subject of our next lecture. Germany then declares war on the United States 3 days after that on December 10th, 1941. So for the first 2 years of the war, it is going to be Britain and for a little bit of that time France really alone against the Germans. And the Germans eventually bring the Soviet Union into the war and the Japanese bring the United States into the war. And that effectively completes the Allied powers. So this is really the first half, if you want to think about it, in the sense of how the war looked. Certainly, there was more war fought after the United States entered than there was beforehand, but the differences are immense because the Soviet Union and the United States were very different animals to Britain and France and their engagements with Germany. Now, remember, in September of 1939, Hitler had not expected to be fighting a world war. He had expected for Britain and France to back down, either not to declare war on him, or after having declared war to be willing to make peace with Hitler very, very quickly, because of course Poland wasn't going to last long, and in fact it lasted less than a month. But much to Hitler's surprise, October, November, December of 1939 come and go, and the British and French governments are no more willing to speak with Hitler or negotiate with him. They say, no, the only way we will negotiate with you is if you give Poland back all of her territory. If you free Poland, then we can talk. And of course, Hitler's not willing to do this. And so they're really at an impasse. They can't agree, they can't make peace, and it simply is what it is. And Hitler realizes that he is going to actually have to decide what to do. He's going to have to fight a war. Now, an invasion from France was unlikely because just like the French, the Germans had built a huge line of fortresses in the Rhineland directly across from the French Maginot Line, which we talked about last time, this huge network of impenetrable forts. The Germans had built a similar line of impenetrable forts called the Gustav Line. So there's really no hope of a World War I style assault into France or Germany. The defensive fortifications were simply too strong. You couldn't fight your way through. You couldn't blast your way through. The men in those fortresses had enough supplies to last for upwards of 6 months. There was really no options on how to move forward. And so both sides are really going to spin their wheels in the mud for a little while, if I can use a vehicle analogy. And that's why we call the period between October and June of 1939 to 1940 the phony war. Because Britain, France, and Germany were at war, but they did very, very little. In fact, Germany spent most of its energy conquering two places that weren't really in the French and British sphere of influence in the first place. The German troops rolled into Denmark, and there was technically a few days of fighting between Danish and German forces, primarily in areas that didn't receive the quick Danish surrender, because of course Denmark was not going to be able to fight off the Germans. Norway, on the other hand, did intend to fight against the Nazis, except they were betrayed by one of their own by the name of Quisling. And Quisling actually basically gave the Germans cover to get into Norway. And before the Norwegians knew it, the government in Oslo had been basically taken by German paratroopers, and Quisling had been installed as a German puppet in Norway itself. So the Norwegian government was replaced by a pro-Nazi government very, very quickly. The British attempted to land troops in Upper Norway, and actually the intention there was to block steel and iron shipments from Sweden through Norway. It's complicated. Let's just put it this way. When things were cold in the winter months, iron mined in Sweden was sent by rail to Norway when it was then sailed south into Germany. The reason for this is the Baltic Sea freezes and the North Atlantic typically does not because of the Gulf Stream. That's all stuff that we don't really need to know. The end of the line is that these British troops in Norway are quickly defeated by the Germans. Importantly, the German Luftwaffe, and the Luftwaffe was the German Air Force, and the British didn't have planes, and so it was very easy for the Germans to defeat the British in Norway. But this is really all that happens for almost 8 months. The Germans are simply cleaning up Norway and Denmark, which is certainly problematic for the British and the French, but really it doesn't move the war along at all. And Germany didn't conquer these regions like it had with Poland or Czechoslovakia. It simply installed pro-German governments. So don't get me wrong, it was still an invasion and it was still wrong, but from an outside perspective, again, not much had happened during this thing. Germany had simply forced a different government into these two nations. Now, by the way, during the war, Germany effectively ruled over Denmark and Norway until 1945. So they were effectively parts of the German Empire, but not in name, and not during the phony war. It looked like Germany was just putting a new government in place. Finally, all of this ends at the very end of May 1940, and the reason for this is because Hitler is concerned that if he continues to be at war with Britain and France, eventually the Soviet Union will decide to break its treaty with Germany and will attack Germany in the east. So Germany really has no interest in fighting the British or the French. He wants them to make a peace agreement. He doesn't care. He doesn't want to fight. They don't have really much territory he wants, with the exception of Alsace-Lorraine, and there was no way he was getting that at this time. And so really Hitler just primarily wanted peace. But the problem was, if the Russians attacked in the east, that might cause serious problems for Germany. And so if Britain and France wouldn't sign peace, then Hitler was going to have to try to force the issue with them. Now, one of the things that Hitler had been doing on his rise to power was he had been investing in new types of technology, and not just Hitler, but many of the Nazis. Some of these new technologies included very efficient fighter planes, which the Germans had actually already had an opportunity to train and use in the Spanish Civil War, which was occurring from 1936 through 1939. Many German flyers had gone to Spain and had participated in air raids on communist Spanish forces for the National Socialist Spanish, the Nazi Spanish, effectively, is who they were. And the most famous, by the way, event about this is the famous Pablo Picasso painting called Guernica. It's probably his most famous work. He was actually president of a city that got bombed by German airplanes, and he made his very famous painting about that event. And it's a cubist painting, so all of the people look funny and they're coming out of walls and things are all bent and twisted around. But this was supposed to show the anguish created by this bombing, and I think it does that quite well. If you look at this painting, you certainly sense the devastation the aerial bombs can create. So first off, the Germans have a well-developed air force. This is something that the French had not invested in at all, and the British were just starting to invest in 1939. He had also produced very heavy industrialized machinery. And the way he had done this is actually it was a ploy to create things that were actually for a war, but the French and the British didn't know for a war. And so Hitler had encouraged many German factories to begin producing what he called tractors. But of course, these tractors were not actually tractors to use on the field, in the farm. They were actually the tank treads of large armored fighting vehicles. That's the kind of tractor that Hitler had been building. And so he has a large fleet of tanks with which to use, and these tanks, rather than being incredibly heavy and bulky like French and British tanks, they were actually very fast moving. The average British tank deployed early in the war had a top speed of approximately 10 miles an hour. The average German tank had a top speed of approximately 25 miles an hour. Now, I know that doesn't sound fast by car terms, but that means that German tanks were more than twice as fast as British tanks, meaning that those German tanks could move around the battlefield, move across the countryside very, very quickly, in comparison to their allied counterparts. With these two developments, with a strong air force and heavy tanks, Hitler is able to launch a surprise attack on the French that is going to devastate France, and it is going to end the war in France in less than 6 weeks. Mind you that the French and the Germans had fought for 5 years in World War I with almost no gain. Germany is going to end the war in France in less than 6 weeks. This is how they do it. The Germans analyzed the lines between themselves and the French, and they noticed that, again, just like in World War I, the best way between Germany and France was by way of neutral Belgium. Belgium had not declared war yet, neither had the Netherlands, and Germany this time decided they wouldn't just push through Belgium, but they intended to take both Belgium and the Netherlands over. By doing so, this would open up the opportunity for the Germans to use that southern corner of Belgium, a place called the Ardennes Forest, and use it to enter behind the French line of forts. Now again, the French had considered this impossible. The terrain was very, very rugged. There was really no way for a truck to drive through here, but the Germans didn't need trucks. They had tanks. They had these huge wheeled or treaded vehicles that could go through almost any terrain, plow down trees if they needed to. In fact, there's videos of German tanks doing just that. And so the Germans invade Belgium, and at the same time, several German army groups with tanks and planes overhead pour through the Ardennes forest. And suddenly the French find that their forces, who had been positioned right near the Belgian border, expecting an attack similar to World War I, found that German tanks, planes, and troops now cut them off from the city of Paris. So soon what we have happening is the French army is cut in half. Half of it is south of Paris, and the other half is north of Paris, and they cannot connect with each other. They can't communicate with each other easily. They can't share supplies. They can't share resources. And the German army that had slammed into Belgium was quickly dealing with the Belgian army. The Belgian army had been heavily reinforced. It was a really well-equipped force, and it quickly was crushed before German attacks. And the main thing responsible for this is two things. Number one, absolute surprise on a tactical level. What does that mean? Well, the attack on Belgium was not a surprise from a strategic level. The French knew that Belgium was going to be attacked. But where exactly German troops were, that was a surprise. And they were so quick moving. Because again, those German tanks could drive 25 miles an hour. Germans could attack, and by the time you got the message that the Germans were attacking one location, they were already in the next location attacking you. So there's no opportunity for the French and British forces to really tell each other, hey, we're under attack, the German tanks are already there. This is called Blitzkrieg, which is German for lightning war. Planes and tanks would rush forward and take key positions, and then the German troops would come behind. The German troops are still limited in speed. They're just guys. They're walking, they're marching, they're jogging, but they're really not that fast, but they don't need to be. The armor and the planes have already secured locations, and now they just need to go and occupy those locations. And the French and British and Belgians are just devastated. The Belgians are forced to surrender after 18 days of fighting. And this decision is criticized by the British especially, but the Belgians had no other chance, no other choice. They were beaten completely. The French were cut in half, and the French to the north of the German advance had no option except to retreat. They no longer had access to ammunition. They no longer had access to fuel. There was only one place to go, and that was to attempt to escape to Britain. And of course, the British were going to do the same thing. And so the British and French lined up on a beach at Dunkirk, and hundreds of thousands of troops were evacuated by the British in one of the most daring evacuations of all time. And the British used every available ship, and that includes warships, fishing trawlers, cargo vessels, and they were able to extract hundreds of thousands of British troops and many of the French troops, although not all the French troops were willing to leave. By the way, the only reason that the British were able to do this is because for some reason Hitler decided to order a halt to the German advance. In fact, many people believe the reason that he did this was because the German air commander, Hermann Göring, promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe alone could destroy the rest of the British army. And of course it couldn't for several reasons. Number one, the British Royal Air Force was already learning how to fight the German airplanes, something that we'll talk about a little bit later on. And in addition to this, bad weather prevented planes from taking off close to Dunkirk. And so the Luftwaffe wasn't able to get as many planes in the air as they wanted to. So because of this, many of the British troops escape. But for France, the country is doomed. The German troops sweep south, taking Paris after less than a week of fighting. To add insult to injury, near the end of June, Mussolini in Italy, Hitler's ally, declares war on France. France doesn't have any troops to fight him at this point. They are already beaten, but this just adds insult to injury. And suddenly France is attacked from two directions, and the French leadership just collapses. Now, some of those French evacuated at Dunkirk formed what was called the Government in Exile of France, and they never surrendered. They said, no, the spirit of the French people is indomitable. We will continue to fight the Germans until we are all destroyed. But the people in charge in Paris, the people in charge of the French army, they give up. After 6 weeks of fighting, in July of 1940, the nation of France signs a surrender agreement with the Germans. In the very same train car, by the way, that they had forced force the Germans to sign the Treaty of Versailles. And this is a humiliating treaty for France. The entire northern area of France, including the capital of Paris, is effectively given to Germany as a German occupation zone. The province of Alsace-Lorraine, that piece of territory that Germany and France had been fighting over for the last 100 years, was given to Germany, and the southern part of France was required to become a German ally. We typically refer to this part of France as Vichy France, named after the city of Vichy, Vichy, where the government was based. And technically, that means that France is the only power, major power, that was technically part of both the Allies and the Axis. Okay? So, this leaves Britain alone. And Britain is in a very difficult situation. First of all, the British Army is nothing compared to the Germans. Second of all, the German Luftwaffe is the most powerful air force on the planet, and if the Germans can take control of the skies, it's possible for the first time in modern history that the Germans might be able to send troops across the English Channel and invade Britain. And if they can get troops into Britain, based on their performance in France, everyone knows who's going to win that battle. It's not going to be Britain, it's going to be the Germans. In addition to this, there's even a threat to the English fleet, because not only do the Germans have their own warships, but because France has surrendered and technically become a German ally, the French fleet was now available to the Germans, and the Italians had joined the war, so the Italian fleet was available to the Germans. And so theoretically, the Germans could have brought the entire German, French, and Italian fleets against the British. There was enough ships between the three of these fleets to actually challenge the British for control of the ocean. So in the late fall of 1940, Britain was in a horrible position. They were the only nation standing against Germany, and if they faltered, if they made a mistake, they would be destroyed. Now, there are several good things that occur. First off, the British Mediterranean fleet decided to go on the offensive. First, they destroyed the Italian fleet sitting in the port near Naples, and so they effectively ended the Italian navy as a viable threat against the British themselves. They also took it upon themselves to sink the French fleet, which, by the way, is something that still divides France and Britain to this day. The British war fleet sailed into Marseille, which is a major port on the south side of France, and opened fire on the French. The French are completely surprised by this. They're not expecting an attack by the British, but the British said the threat of the Germans getting your fleet was too high. The fact that your government surrendered means we have to destroy your fleet. And so the British destroy both the Italian and the French fleets. And so the threat of a naval attack on Britain is gone. But the threat of an air attack by the Luftwaffe is not gone. In fact, Hermann Göring again promised Hitler that in September of 1940, he would bring Winston Churchill and the British government to their knees. He would drop so many bombs on London that Britain would sue for peace with Hitler. Okay, and Hitler, by the way, was still willing to give a very, very nice peace deal to the British. He didn't want any territory from Britain. He just wanted everything he had already taken. And yet, it turns out two things that Hermann Göring did not expect occurred. Number one, the British Royal Air Force proved that they were the equals of the Germans in their ability to fly warplanes. And the British actually had some very advanced planes that were going to serve as incredibly good anti-fighter vehicles. And these two planes are the Hurricane and the Spitfire. These two British planes flown by RAF pilots are responsible for sending thousands of German planes down as they attacked London during September. In fact, this air attack on London is called the Battle of Britain. And effectively, the Luftwaffe was trying to bomb Britain to her knees, and Britain managed to survive. Okay, children were evacuated. You might be familiar with that from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And British pilots flew hundreds of fighter missions to stop the Germans. But after a month of fighting, the Germans had failed. In fact, the Germans had failed so badly that they realized that if they kept flying day missions, they could never survive and have enough planes to continue to fight a war. And so the Germans switched to attacking the British during the night, mostly. They did attack during the day occasionally, but they mostly attacked during the night. This is called the Blitz, the attack of these German planes. They would fly in very quickly, drop bombs, and then fly away like a blitzing linebacker. They came in through the defenses, they hit hard, and now they're going back to where they came from. But effectively what this had proved was that the British were indomitable. They would not surrender to Hitler. And you guys are going to be reading probably one of of the most awe-inspiring speeches given of all time by Sir Winston Churchill, where he talks about the British resolve to fight on the beaches, to fight in the streets, to fight in the hills, to fight in the countryside, to never surrender. And the British would fight and fight and fight until, as Churchill said at the very end of his speech, the new world with all of its strength would come for the redemption of the old. Now, who was he talking about? He wasn't talking about Canada. Canada was already involved in the war. He was talking, of course, about the United States and the almost unlimited manpower and material resources that the United States had at its disposal. Now, let's talk about the United States. This isn't a world history class. The entire point of all of that background from both last lecture and this is to give us an idea of where the United States was and what they were doing. So the United States at this point in the war certainly sympathized with the British. Hitler was not a very credible guy. All of this talk about attacking Poland and Czechoslovakia to help Germans didn't really get much traction in the American press. The American press was not very fond of Hitler. They pointed out that Hitler was a hypocrite and that he was attacking and killing people, and he had attacked neutral Belgium again, second time in 20 years. Belgium really ought to get some better defenses or something like that. And so American general public opinion is that Germany was in the wrong. However, American public opinion was also against the idea of joining the war. We've been there. We did that one time. It created a collapse in our economy. 1929, Great Depression. Many people blame that on American intervention during World War I. And so Americans were really not interested in joining into the war. But the American government, on the other hand, was in a different situation. The American government began to think long and hard about what Hitler might do if the war in Europe went his way. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in fact, told a staff meeting that if Germany defeats Britain, the next place that he will come is the Soviet Union. And if he somehow contains and controls the Soviet Union, he will be coming for us next. And certainly the Americans were already having conflicts with the Japanese that we'll talk about in the next lecture, so we won't get into that here. But the American government was concerned that if Britain fell, that a unified Europe controlled by Hitler would eventually desire to come for the United States as well. Now, whether Hitler would have done that or not is speculation. Hitler died, fortunately, long before he could make those plans. But certainly, I think that was within the realm of possibility. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt began to theorize on ways that he could support the British, but he was very limited in how he could do this because, again, the American public did not want to get involved in a war. And in fact, American politicians passed something called the Neutrality Act. The Neutrality Act forbade the president to sell weapons to anyone currently fighting in the war. Now, that didn't hurt Germany at all. Germany was blockaded by the British. They couldn't buy American weapons, but this badly hurt the British, because the British wanted to buy American guns, they wanted to buy American ships, American planes, they wanted to buy these things to fight the Germans. So the Neutrality Act actually helped the Germans and hurt the British, and so the Germans were feeling pretty good about things in the beginning of 1940. But as Winston Churchill adamantly stood against Hitler, he began to converse with FDR and ask FDR, is there any assistance that you would be willing to give? And at first FDR says, I'm willing to give you, but I can't. But as time goes on, FDR is able to convince more and more people in his government that should Britain fall, the United States will be on the chopping block soon after that. And so he's able to begin passing bills that effectively allow the United States to support Britain, but not fight a war. And it's going to do this in a number of ways. The two most famous programs are destroyers for bases, which all of you will be reading about next week. So I won't spoil that program. I want you guys to learn about that through your reading by a very famous and very up-to-date on his information author, who I think you'll enjoy. The other important program was Lend-Lease, and we'll spend most of our time talking about Lend-Lease today. Just like World War I, Britain quickly ran out of money to fight the war. In fact, they were running out of money by the end of 1940, and so they needed to float cash from someone else to fight their war. This time the United States had learned from history and realized that rather than give Britain loans, effectively what it would do is it would lend Britain money with no interest attached. So they would give Britain money, they would expect to be repaid, but this wasn't a normal loan. This wasn't going to require the British to make interest payments. This wasn't going to require the British to pay at a certain time. Effectively, what this does is it allows the United States to begin bankrolling the British war. So Britain is borrowing money from the United States to pay their soldiers, to build their planes, to pay their people that are working in government industries. The British government is being supported by the Americans. Eventually, FDR is able to pass a bill that allows the United States to sell weapons to Canada, despite the fact that Canada is involved in the war. And from Canada, many of those products were shipped across the Atlantic to the British. The British would buy them from the Canadians, and the Canadians would buy them from the British, and so from the Americans, excuse me. And so effectively, to get around the Neutrality Act, they made an exception for Canada because of its close proximity, and then the British simply bought American weapons from the Canadians at no cost. And so we have workarounds, and eventually this program begins exporting things like food. It begins exporting raw materials because Britain gets smart. What it figures out is we can convert every factory in Great Britain to taking materials and turning them into war products. So fine, we can't buy guns from the Americans, but we can buy everything we need to make a gun, and then we can just turn it into a gun ourselves. So effectively what's happening is raw materials are being bought from the United States, shipped across the Atlantic by American ships. Okay, not British ships. Those British ships are being used for the war. They're shipped across the Atlantic in American ships, and then the British take those things and very quickly transform them into weapons to fight the Germans. And by the way, the Germans were aware of this, and they loudly protested this. They said, United States, this is effectively like declaring war. And the Americans said, oh, this isn't war. In Germany, you don't want a repeat of World War I. And the Germans grumbled, and they weren't very happy about this, but they allowed it to continue and continue and to continue. This Lend-Lease program would be responsible for feeding the British Isles and maintaining huge amounts of supplies for the British all throughout the war. Now, to skip ahead, after 1941, after December 7, 1941, the United States enters the war. The Germans attack the Russians, which we will talk about at a later date. The United States actually begins supplying Russia as well, and so soon Lend-Lease is expanded. Not only is it supplying the British with goods, but it's supplying the Russians with goods. And once the Americans enter the war, no longer are they restricted from selling weapons to Britain and Russia, and so soon American planes, tanks, and guns are pouring into Britain and Russia. In fact, we almost have a resurgence of that old British technique from the Napoleonic era where the British would pay other people to fight their wars. This time the Americans aren't so much just paying for other people to fight their wars, which they are. They were paying Russia and Great Britain to continue to fight, but they're not only paying them, but they're arming them. They said, here you go, Russia, here's 100,000 warplanes. Okay, use these to blow the Germans up. Here you go, Britain. Here's destroyers and battleships and tanks. Use these to fight the Germans. No, yeah, by the way, after December 7th, 1941, we're going to join in on fighting the Germans, and we're also going to fight the Japanese almost by ourselves. So the American economy, which has been languishing and slow since 1929, in 1939 begins to pick up. Begins to have to fill all of these orders from Britain. And then in 1941, not only is the American economy building its own weapons and ships and planes and tanks and food, but it's also building almost all of the food and many of the weapons for the Russians and the British. And the American economy just becomes this unstoppable behemoth of production. In fact, near the end of the war, it was possible for the United States to put a bomber out of the Ford plants in Detroit every 16 minutes. Every 16 minutes, the United States could create a plane. The Germans, on the other hand, could create one plane every day. So I want you to do a quick math problem if you're interested. Let's just make it simple so your math is easier. Imagine one American plant being able to produce a plane every 15 minutes, and the entire nation of Germany able to produce one plane every day. And quickly do the math and see how outnumbered the Germans were going to be. This is the power of the American economy. This is the power of American industry. And through the means of Lend-Lease, the United States is able to equip their allies with almost unlimited amounts of supplies and weapons. And this is going to be probably the most important contribution that the United States made to the war in Europe. Certainly the United States fought the brunt of the war in Asia against the Japanese, at least at sea. Of course, the Chinese had been fighting since 1937, and the Australians were going to be involved as well. But the United States is going to contribute almost unlimited amount of goods and economic power to the Western allies, and that is going to be key to defeating the Germans. Tomorrow we will talk about the entry of the United States into World War II. We'll also talk about the biggest German mistake of World War II, and that, of course, was the invasion of Russia. So 2 monumental events that changed the course of the war on our discussion for our next lecture.